Good morning, and thank you for joining us as we commemorate Genocide Prevention and Awareness Month. I'm your host, historian Edna Friedberg. Today, we'd like to reshare a program about Raphael Lemkin, the Holocaust survivor who coined the term genocide. 49 members of Lemkin's family were killed during the Holocaust. He poured the last 15 years of his life into ensuring that genocide, the intentional destruction of a group, was recognized as an international crime. Today's program was originally broadcast in April 2021. So let's start by introducing people to this absolutely extraordinary man. Raphael Lemkin is one of those characters in history who spent decades pushing the proverbial rock up a hill, and he succeeded in creating an entirely new concept in law. Why don't more of us know his story?
Yeah, so Lemkin is a towering figure for specialists, right? So for people who work on genocide studies, for some legal scholars, he was nominated for the Nobel Prize at least 10 times within his own lifetime. But he's not widely known. And so I think part of that is because of the fact that his contribution was part of legal history, and legal history can be quite dry and alienating. Um, but I think one of the things that's really difficult in his story is it's not exactly a happy ending. He accomplished quite a lot in his lifetime, and that's what we'll be talking about later. But he also died penniless and alone, and the record of how we respond to genocide has also proven time and time again to pose challenges. But as a child, he was obsessed with history. And parts of the history that most compelled him were those that told these stories of people who had succumbed to, who were targeted because of who they were. So he talks a lot in his memoir about the persecution of Christians under the Roman Empire. That was one of the early influences on him. As he grew up, he studied languages and ultimately became able to speak in at least 10, which is extraordinary. And he studied law. So he became a lawyer, and that became his tool craft for his contributions to the world. That he was always trying, right, even before the Holocaust, to find ways to use the law to protect people. And he also, right, so this is again, think of him in the 1930s as a minority in Poland, seeing what was happening in the changes in Germany. And he was paying close attention to the legal changes that was changing and taking away rights from entire groups of people.
Now, Bridget, obviously Lemkin was, concerned with this issue, was working on it already, but how did his sense of urgency around what to this point is legal theory change with the advent of the Second World War?
Right, so when the German army invaded Poland, Lemkin was in Warsaw. And here you can see the footage of some of the early destruction of the initial invasion. Lemkin, shortly afterwards, decided to leave Warsaw. There's an evacuation of military-aged men, and he was on a train that was bombed. He then spent several weeks. This is essentially his first experience of being a displaced person, a refugee, someone fleeing on foot in his case. He went with this large groups of people who were trying to figure out where they could find safety as the German army was heading their way. He spent time in a barn. He walked in great hunger. And he eventually decided that he would leave, but he wanted to see his family one more time. And so he made his way up to his parents' house, where his brother was also living in the same town. And he managed to spend just a few hours, like an overnight, with his parents. Now, for him, as someone who'd been understanding and watching the changes in Germany, he had a sense that this would not be the same as World War I or other times when the Jewish minority might face terrible circumstances. He tried to convince them to flee, And they said, no, we've always lived here. We've gotten through difficult times before. And they actually turned the tables and said, you're the one who needs help. You're alone. You have no wife, no family, and you've made the decision to become a refugee, to leave your home. And they expressed their love and their concern and their hopes that he would be protected. And he fled north to Lithuania and then to Sweden and eventually across the Soviet Union. He stopped over in Japan and made his way to the United States by 1941.
And he was one of the lucky ones that he was able to not only physically make it to the United States, but have a visa to allow him to enter. He would never see his family again. And in fact, by the end of the Holocaust, 49 members of Raphael Lemkin's family would be dead, murdered as part of the crime that at that point had no name. Bridget, we have a question from a viewer. Joseph from Boston is asking, didn't Lemkin view the massacre of the Armenians as a genocide? And I know that he was, in fact, profoundly influenced by this, but tell us a little bit more about how he became aware and what it did to his thinking.
Yeah, so Lemkin was profoundly impacted by what had happened to Armenians under Ottoman Turkey. He wrote about it consistently in his memoir. It was one of the cases that helped prompt him to think through, why do we even need this term genocide? Because remember, as he's learning about this and during this journey, the word doesn't even exist yet. And so one case, though, that he read about previously before he fled was a young man whose name was Soghomon Tehlirian. Here you see a photograph of him. His family was killed in the Armenian genocide, where up to 1 million Armenians were targeted, many in their villages. Those who were not initially killed were forcibly displaced into the desert, where hundreds of thousands and up to 1 million were killed. Tehlirian's family was assaulted immediately in attack on their village, and he survived by hiding under his mother's body. When he grew up, he eventually made his way back to Europe and decided that he would revenge his family's memory. And he assassinated an Ottoman Turkish leader named Mehmet Talat Pasha. Lemkin heard about this because it made news. The assassination occurred in Paris, and Lemkin read the paper and was really quite taken aback by this extraordinary gap in our legal tools at that time. So Tehlirian was charged with homicide for killing one man. But as Lemkin noted, there was no crime for killing 1 million civilians when it was done by a government.
And indeed, he wrote that specifically. Lemkin wrote, with regard to the Tehlirian case, why is the killing of 1 million a lesser crime than the killing of an individual? And it's partly because it was so big and undefined that it was there. And for those of you who are less aware, or perhaps this is a new term for you, you should know that the Armenians were a Christian minority living in the Muslim majority Ottoman Empire, and we'll be posting links in the comments where you can learn more about this mass targeting of them as a group in the years 1915 to 16. So Bridget, once Lemkin made it to the United States, how did he continue to wave his flag, to pursue his mission?
So because Lemkin had a network as an international lawyer, he had a network of colleagues and he had a reputation. He'd published quite a bit. So he managed to get a position at Duke University. So when he first arrived in the US, he went to Duke and taught for a bit, but very quickly he took a position in Washington, D.C. with the War Department. And here you can see a photo of him from later in his life. In Washington, he started the process then of going through this archive of text that he had gathered, both from when he was in Poland and also from the time that he spent in Sweden, where he was grabbing documents about what the Axis powers were doing through legal decrees in the areas that they occupied. Um, and what we see of Lemkin from his memoir during this period in Washington, D.C., you see a man who is really haunted by his knowledge of what was happening in Europe. He was one of the people who had a strong sense of the fate that European Jews, including his own parents, were undergoing. And he was trying desperately, right, to send out letters. He made an effort. He was invited, and he drafted a memo to send to President Roosevelt saying, look, we need to make a strong public statement condemning what he recognized as acts of genocide, to do anything like in our hands to stop it, to say that this will be criminalized, that this is not okay, we're not going to accept it. And he talks about, having nightmares during this time period of his mother coming to him, and of trying to live a day-to-day life, even in a city that was mobilized for war, but a city so far and so distant, and knowing that at the same time that the world that he grew up in was being destroyed. And it really seems like from that moment forward, he invests all of his energy in making sure that this pattern of acts that he recognized would be given a conceptual name. And in 1944, he published a book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. That's the first time we see the term genocide introduced.
And he reached, hallways of power with this. I seem to recall that he met, in fact, with Vice President Wallace from the Roosevelt administration and others. He became an influential person in Washington. But we have a clip from a movie about Lemkin called Watchers of the Sky that shows in his own handwriting his attempts to create this new word. He was someone who was gifted in languages, who was multilingual, and he struggled to come up with a term that would encapsulate the complexity of this crime. Let's see him experimenting with language in order to arrive at the term genocide.
But in the end, what he settles on is a Greek-Latin hybrid, genos, people, tribe, race, with the Latin sedere, side, for killing or destroying. You see it in the notebooks, him, kind of trying different things out and then settling upon this word, which he thinks can in fact connote that moral judgment that he feels is necessary.
He's trying to describe something that previously has not had a label or a name, but also that we might not previously have thought of many of these massive crimes as being related to each other without Lemkin's gift and prescience for thinking there needs to be an umbrella under which all of these things exist. Bridget, then, so this was in 1944, as you said, that he first published the term. In the aftermath of the war, or even in the waning months of the war, how did Lemkin then try to put this into practice?
Yeah, so Lemkin was part of the team that was drafting the indictments against some of the major war criminals. And he manages to get his term, genocide, inserted into the indictment. And so I think it's really important, right? This is a word that didn't exist before in the public realm, right? Published before 1944. But very quickly, because of where he's situated, because of his knowledge and his ability to participate in that process as a lawyer, he is able to get it included. So now it has a life in this official document. But it's really important to remember at this point, it's not a law, right? It doesn't have legal standing. It's a term that's describing multiple acts when targeted against groups systematically. He, however, was disappointed in the Nuremberg decisions. At the time, the legal category that encapsulated these crimes against civilians was crimes against humanity. And it would only come into effect during an international armed conflict. And Lemkin thought that that decision was too narrow. From his study of history, he knew that the Holocaust, what we now know of as the Holocaust, and patterns of targeting entire national groups during World War II, that those were extreme examples. But he knew from studying history that this was not something that either began nor would it end with World War II. And so he wanted to see his word get that legal power behind it, right? To have life as a legal document. And so he embarked on a mission that really spanned the rest of his life, and making sure that the word would become law.
So in some ways, Lemkin, you could look at him and say his was a quintessential immigrant success story. Within 5 years of arriving in a new country as a largely unknown refugee professor, he's already an influential policy advisor in Washington, involved in post-war prosecutions, but he was about to become known to a much wider circle. Tell us about what Lemkin did next, and how it involved him with the fledgling United Nations.
Yeah, so it's important to remember at this point, the United Nations is just getting started. And so there are a series of meetings all over the world. Lemkin ends up attending several of them in New York, in Geneva, and in Paris. And he becomes, which is the title of his memoir, an unofficial man. And what he means by that is he becomes a delegate for the convention. That's, I think, how he sees his mission. He doesn't represent a state or a country or particular peoples. He goes to these meetings as an advocate for a genocide convention. Here he is pictured with a member of the Brazilian delegation. The Latin American delegations were some of the ones that Lemkin targeted first. Some of the smaller countries didn't come with the big, already established agendas, the way the Soviets, the US, and the British. So in some of the smaller countries, Lemkin was able to make outreach to them. And he needed these national delegates to put genocide on the agenda, right? And so it had to go through rounds of drafting and committees and all of this work that defines genocide and makes it a law. And he was there all along, right? Pushing and pushing and doing personal outreach to delegates from many different countries. He would talk about meeting with people, and from his knowledge of history, trying to show them that their own national history had an intersection with genocide in the past.
Lemkin certainly paid a very steep personal price for his single-mindedness. He was so dedicated to the point of obsession. Someone might say, what's happening in his personal life? What's he doing to make a living?
Yeah, so he would often have jobs that were part-time. He would teach like one course here, one course there, do smaller activities, but essentially he was someone who lived his life, and he had many friends too. I should say that he had secretaries, and there were women that seemed like they could have been love interest or maybe the potential for starting a family, which, I mean, Edna, as you know, for many Holocaust survivors, that idea of rebuilding family was central. For Lemkin, it wasn't the case. He really put all of those sort of other commitments aside and made them secondary to his life's mission, right, of seeing this convention be drafted, be moved through all the national discourses that were trying to change the definition in ways he didn't want to see. And then finally, once the convention was drafted and when it passed, he was just absolutely exhausted. It's a reporter said that they found him in the back of the stairwell when the convention passed, and they're like, shouldn't you be celebrating? You should be out in front of the cameras, touting this insane, incredible accomplishment. And he was just collapsed and said that the convention was the epitaph on his mother's grave.
And indeed, 4 years after Lemkin had published the word genocide, the United Nations approved the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide on December 9th, 1948. Let's have a look. It was major news when this happened, and let's have a look at a brief TV clip of Raphael Lemkin appearing on CBS News in 1949 to talk about it.
Dr. Lemkin is the man who created the word genocide. Dr. Lemkin, could you give us a little background on how you came to be interested in this genocide?
I became interested in genocide because it happened so many times. It happened to the Armenians, and after the Armenians, Hitler took action.
I'm struck looking at this also, you hear him, he himself has accented English, like he himself is a refugee and had, achieved this incredible thing, but the approval of the convention did not actually give it legal force, did not make it international law. What did Lemkin turn to next in his crusade?
Yeah, so the crafting of the convention gives us the language, right? It defines the law in ways that are very, very specific, but it doesn't come into force until 20 nations ratify it, sign it, ratify it, and adopt national legislation. And so really from 1948 until his death in 1959, he continues to be the unofficial man. Right? He's the man who left his home as a refugee and spent the rest of his life creating a home within this convention, essentially, right? Investing all of his time, his efforts, and his energy into seeing this convention become something that could potentially have real impact in the world. He died, as I noted, in 1959. He had crafted this memoir and was on his way to a publisher to talk about it when he collapsed at a bus stop in New York. He reports even, wearing threadbare suits and sometimes not having enough to eat. I mean, he really committed all of his energy and resources into this constant effort.
Bridget, so what has been this legacy? It passes, it's ratified by many countries, although I should note that the United States resisted joining for many, many decades, fearful that it would infringe on U.S. national sovereignty. President Ronald Reagan finally signed the convention in November 1998. But what's been the legacy? When was the first convention under this law that Lemkin helped to birth?
Yeah, so the first conviction for the crime of genocide after trial before an international tribunal wasn't until 1998. This first conviction for genocide was for a mayor of a small town in Rwanda. His name is Jean-Paul Akayesu, and he initially resisted the forces that were implementing the genocide. But when called to a meeting in the capital and basically told, you have to do this, he embraced the logic of killing and used his influence and authority to target Tutsi minority within the town where he was mayor. So that's the first conviction. And here we see a photo from some of those who were killed in the Rwandan genocide. It was really important to honor and commemorate the losses of that horrific genocide.
We have a question, Bridget, from a viewer named Alessio. Alessio writes, I'm teaching a class on mass killings and genocide at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. With my students, we've been talking a lot about Lemkin and the importance of his work. Why do you think that the international community has been watering down the concept of genocide? And is it easier to receive justice given the, quote, flexibility of the term crimes against humanity? Is there a way you can help people who are less familiar with law to understand this distinction and what it might mean in practice?
Yeah, so crimes against humanity, right, that was the legal category that we noted under which Nazi leadership was prosecuted. And at the time, it only applied in international armed conflict. Most of the time, and this is something that Lemkin knew well, people are killed by their own governments. And so this idea that it doesn't even exist as a legal category unless there's an international war, that wouldn't have protected very many people. Genocide is a quirky crime in its legal definition, and that you have to have the intent to destroy the group as such. So prosecutors don't need to prove just that X, Y, Z happened, right? So facts on the ground. They have to prove that within the mindset of the perpetrator, there was this larger intention to kill the entire group. And that's been one of the really tricky spots for prosecutors.
In closing, Bridget, Raphael Lemkin would probably be heartbroken by the continued violence against minority peoples around the world. Could you please help us to understand the imperfect legacy of Lemkin and what you hope people will take away from him?
Yeah, so Lemkin, if we can picture him back in Washington, D.C., right, desperately trying to get attention for what he knew what was happening, right? And he could see it in these decrees as life was changing. He could hear it in the news. He felt haunted by it as his mother, would appear to him in his nightmares. What he did, though, during that time period was give us a word so that we can see what genocide is. And Lemkin's view of humanity, this is my interpretation of it, though, is something akin to how we think about like ecological diversity, that the beauty of this world is not who has more power, who controls everything, but the beauty was in all the diverse forms of knowledge, the diverse forms of beauty that existed across this incredibly complex humanity in which we live. And Lemkin gave us, right, first that word, and then through his lifelong efforts, a legal document, a legal statute, right, that nations have signed on to and promised to uphold. Now, the fact that they don't pushes the challenge onto us, right? Lemkin ran this relay race. He ran his leg. And I think what he does for us is he asks us then to pick up that baton and to continue to run that race. The point wasn't to, ideally, of course, we would love that genocide would never, ever happen again and we never had to worry about it. But I think the real point is how we continue to struggle, oppose, and fight against it whenever we see it.
I'm Jen Schmidt, Director of Planning and Operations for the museum's Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide. Raphael Lemkin's tenacity reminds us of the power of a single person to change the world. One of the things that we know about the Holocaust was that there were many moments along the way where it could have been stopped. If people had responded to the warning signs and acted early, many lives would have been saved. Our center was founded on the belief that we must do for the victims of genocide today what the world failed to do for the Jews of Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. Let me tell you about some of our recent work. The museum's exhibition, Burma's Path to Genocide, shares the stories of several individuals, including Jamila, a Rohingya woman whose husband and 15-year-old son were among those targeted and murdered by the Burmese military in 2017 because of their identity. The Rohingya, a Muslim minority in Burma, has faced a long history of severe discrimination, persecution, and violence at the hands of the Burmese authorities. The day after the attack in 2017, Jamila walked hundreds of miles to escape into neighboring Bangladesh with her 4 daughters. She carried the youngest children on her back, along with her son's books. It was all she had left of him. Even years later, Jamila sleeps next to her son's treasured school bag. These crimes tear at our hearts and cause a domino effect of damage, destroying lives, traumatizing societies, and destabilizing regions as innocent people are forced to flee across borders. The Simon Scott Center is a world leader in the fight against genocide and related crimes against humanity. Our center focuses on disrupting mass violence at every stage, including calling for action before atrocities begin, mobilizing the political will to act to save lives when violence explodes, and helping empower communities to push for justice through training and resources that support survivor-led initiatives to hold perpetrators accountable. During the museum's opening ceremony, founding chairman L.A. Wiesel said, "A memorial unresponsive to the future would violate the memory of the past." The Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide is one way that the museum is fulfilling its mission as a living memorial to the victims of the Holocaust.